John, I have a quick question.
Hi. Okay. Somebody had a question?
Yeah, quick question. So you said I needed to put the sans serif inside of the print, right?
No. The print should be serif. The screen version should be sans serif.
Okay, that's what I'm asking because I have something that's called Open Sans, and that's a sans serif
Right.
out of I think it was
Open Sans is a great font. It's built to be
yeah,
very accessible.
that's one of the ones that I have on
It's one of my
my
favorites. Yeah. Well, that will be good for your screen version, and then your print version should be a
yeah
serif.
yeah I'm what I'm gonna do because I mean I know that things due tonight, but
Oh, you know what? Just do what you can and keep
yeah,
going because
honestly,
we're not
honestly,
worrying about the deadlines today.
yeah, honestly, I just want to see how far I can like get this as
Yeah.
good as I can possible. What I'm planning on doing is I'm gonna see if I can reorganize everything back into just the example 10
Hmm.
style sheet,
Hmm.
just so it's all into one simple
Yeah.
style sheet.
Yeah. You should do that. Makes it simpler.
Do you know? And then for my serif, I have it as Alice regular. That's what I had put for that.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, the idea being that okay, the serif fonts, which serifs are of course the little flourishes at the edges, at the ends of lines and things. Serif fonts are generally more readable um, because the eye can recognize the letter forms easily with the little serif flourishes. But that logic doesn't always hold on the screen because the resolution of the screen and the pixels doesn't give you that same level of detail. You won't see the serifs displayed cleanly. So at small text sizes, generally speaking, sans serif fonts are easier to read on the screen. Now, at large font sizes, it doesn't matter as much. But at body text or smaller, you want you generally want to use sans serif type on the screen, in general. Um, and so that's one of the reasons behind make it display in sans serif on the screen, but make it display in print when you print it, or when you
Mm-hmm.
print it, maybe use a serif font. Um, um,
So when it
if,
comes to style sheets wise, because I was going to ask you
mhm.
this a bit ago, it's usually better to keep everything to a bare minimum when working with style sheets. Because I
um,
noticed that you told me that having two different like screen style sheets was going to make things a little more complicated.
Well, for the purpose of the exercise, it's just simpler if you have a screen style sheet and a print style sheet. It's just
Okay.
because what you're doing is comparing, you're going back and forth between the two. But when you have in the more style sheets, as you had a third one, you had your exercise 10 style sheet, that is going to be viewed as a screen style sheet.
Hmm.
And depending on, the thing is that the print style sheet will pick up the screen styles and then will modify them based on what's in the print style sheet. So uh, it's simpler with two style sheets.
Okay.
So what I want to do is switch gears a little here, unless there's more questions. I mean, I'll keep answering questions, but when we're out of questions, I'm going to go to some different material. Okay, let's talk about a few different things. Did I talk about the HTML5 structural elements? No? Here's what we're going to do.
I remember.
Okay.
No, not that I remember.
Let's do this. I'm going to share my screen. Waiting for my page to load. Hello, page. There we go. All right. Okay. We looked at this last week. I want to talk about a couple of things relating to the final project. One of which is the Wave Web Accessibility Tool, another of which has to do with the HTML5 structural elements. Let me start with the HTML5 structural elements. In HTML5, they added a bunch of new HTML elements. And you see the main ones here: nav, header, footer, aside, article, and section. Actually, they added more than this, but these are the most important ones. So what does that mean? Okay, so what is HTML5? What is HTML in general? HTML is structural, right? So HTML elements merely define what the information is and not how the information should be displayed or styled. That happens in your style sheet. So HTML is relatively simple, and the HTML elements that you're familiar with are, for the most part, very semantic. In other words, H1, H2, H3, they're headlines. LI is list item. P is a paragraph. They all have semantic meaning, meaning they're not generic. We know what a paragraph is. It has a meaning. There's a meaning to the word paragraph. There's a meaning to the word headline. There's a meaning to an item in a list. It literally is an item in a list. I mean, these are not generic pieces of information. They have certain functions. And we have two generic HTML tags. Do you remember what they are? Anybody?
Span and div. Span and div.
Exactly. Div and span. Exactly right. Those two HTML elements are what we call generic because they don't have any semantic meaning. Meaning you don't know what's a div or a span. It could be anything. An H1, we know that's the most important headline on a page. An LI, we know that's an item in a list. A P, we know that's a paragraph of text. I mean, you know, we know what these things are. They have meaning. But div and span are simply generic containers. They're generic elements or tags or containers. They don't tell us anything about the information that's inside the div or inside the span. They're merely kind of placeholders almost that you can attach classes or IDs to give them more semantic meaning. But in and of themselves, they are just containers that can hold any kind of information. So they're very useful. And they're the tags that we use when we don't have a semantic container. So what happened with HTML5 is the people that developed HTML5, they looked at code, they looked at hundreds, thousands, I think millions of lines of code of web pages all across the web, and they looked at how people were using divs and spans. Specifically more divs. Divs are the more useful container. And they saw a lot of div, ID equals menu, div, ID equals, you know, navigation, div, ID equals footer, div, ID equals sidebar. They saw a lot of this kind of stuff because there weren't HTML elements for things like a navigation menu, for things like a banner or header section of a page, things like a footer section of a page, things like a sidebar. We had no HTML elements for these. So they said, well, this is dumb. We should have HTML elements for these common things that many web pages have. So they added a bunch of what we call structural elements. The most important ones are here: nav, header, footer, aside, article, and section. So let's look at these for a second. They're HTML elements just like H1, LI, P, you know, but they have a different meaning. So nav is short for a navigation menu, right? A footer and a header are generally something at the bottom or top of the page. Like a footer, you know what a footer is. It usually has some information. It's usually at the bottom of the page. Some information could be copyright information or, you know, contact information, links to some other things. A header generally would be what's on the top of your page. Maybe it's got a banner image. Maybe the navigation menu is considered part of your header, maybe not. And then we have an aside. An aside is, well, this piece of information is literally an aside to the main information that we're publishing on the page. In the print world, you might call that a sidebar. It might be a little box off to the side. And so we call it an aside. Article and section are a little trickier. Article means this is an article. The section means this is a section of a page or of a part of a page. So article and section are kind of more, they're a little more fluid than the rest. The rest are more clear. Nav, header, aside, footer. We know what those things are. Article and section, they're not quite as specific. So you could define almost any piece of information on your page as an article. The whole page could be an article, or your page could have 3 articles, right? And section is in a sense also somewhat fluid. Like a section could be a section of an article or a section of a page or a section of a div. So section gives you more flexibility there. So you can have articles inside of a section. You can have sections inside of an article. An article could be split into 3 sections. A section could be split into 2 articles. I mean, you know, it's not like one is considered more hierarchically important over the other. So that's a very brief introduction to the new HTML5 structural elements. In the past, if we had a footer on the page, you probably would put the footer in a div and then give that div an ID or a class of footer or bottom or something like that. But now we actually have footer. So you can actually have footer, blah, 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 slash footer. And that, whatever's in that, and that could be a couple of paragraphs, that could be just some plain text, whatever, that will be your footer. So is that, do you see what I mean by these new structural elements?
Yep.
Okay, so when you look at the final project and you go, oh, I get 5 points if I use, you know, these elements in the page, then try to use those elements on the page in a way that makes sense. And you can look these up in references and you'll see some examples of how to use them. But what I really wanted to get to was talking about accessibility. And accessibility, you could teach a whole course in accessibility. We don't have that kind of time in this semester, but you need to know a few basics. So what do we mean by accessibility? Accessibility means that the information that you're publishing needs to be accessible to people who are reading it. Now, accessibility is a subset of usability. Usability means, can somebody use your website easily? Does it make sense to them? Can they function in it? Can they navigate through it? Can they find what they're looking for? How usable is your website? Usability is a concept in all areas of design, not just web design. You know, when you're designing a product, how usable is it? You know, if you're designing a door, well, how easy is it to open and close the door? You know, usability is a broad term. And on the web, usability means just that. Is your site usable by people? If they go to your site and they can't figure out what to do, it's not usable. If they go to your site and it's like, oh, I see here, I click on this, I know what that's going to happen. I'm looking for a certain piece of information. Oh, I can find it. All right, then your site's usable. Accessibility is, as I said, a subset of usability. So accessibility is generally thought of in terms of, is your site usable by people who have different abilities? Maybe they have some kind of visual impairment. Maybe they have a motor impairment. Maybe they have a very small screen, and your page doesn't fit on their screen. It doesn't display properly. They can't access it. They can't use it. So usability and accessibility are related. Accessibility is what we usually call Section 508 accessible or compliant. There are legal standards in all kinds of things, but especially in online material, which are codified into law, both federal and state. Other countries have the equivalents of Section 508, which is a federal law. Most states, like California, they have their own version of Section 508. But generally speaking, Section 508 is the legal standard for accessibility of a website or online published materials. So Section 508 is a whole, I mean, you can look up Section 508. There's that website, section508.gov, which is really good. But, and Section 508 has pretty specific standards. There are like 3 levels of what we call accessibility checkpoints. But the bottom line is that not only is it the law for certain kinds of websites, it's also a good idea. Section 508 applies to websites that are government websites, that are websites that are built by government agencies or by nonprofit agencies that have government funding, or state bodies, schools, their sites have to be 508 compliant. Many organizations by law are supposed to be Section 508 compliant. Cabrillo College's website is supposed to be Section 508 compliant. My website is supposed to be Section 508 compliant. Does that mean that most websites that are supposed to be Section 508 compliant are? Generally speaking, most are not. This is an evolutionary process, even though this has been the law for a number of years. Even today, most sites still are not fully Section 508 compliant, and everybody's moving in that direction, including Cabrillo College. But you need to be aware of it, and you can look it up and read about Section 508. But for now, we're going to focus on some basic elements of accessibility. So if a page doesn't, I think Leslie mentioned this before and I did earlier, if your text is hard to read, for whatever reason, it's hard to read, that's an accessibility issue. Now, your page could be very easy to read by somebody who doesn't have a visual impairment, but maybe somebody has a certain kind of color blindness, and maybe the color choices that you made in your text and your background are not easy for people to see if they have certain kinds of color blindness. And so you get into some contrast issues there. Literally, the size of type can make it not accessible. If you publish a website in 5-pixel type, people can't read it. It's not accessible. If you have a system where people can't navigate your site, it's not accessible. If you have a system where you have images and they do not have alt text, that site is not accessible. In other words, if somebody is blind and they're using software to read aloud the contents of your page, will that work with your website? When they get to an image, do you have alt text in your image tag that describes briefly what that image is about, so that somebody who's blind and surfing can understand what your page is about? Do you have a proper hierarchy of information presented? Do you have one H1 and not 5 H1s on the page? You can't have 5 most important headlines on the page. If your information is not structured in a logical or hierarchical fashion that makes sense to software trying to interpret it, it's going to be hard for somebody who's using software, such as somebody who's visually impaired, to make sense of your page. By the way, it's also harder for search engines to make sense of your page. So there are many reasons to make sure that things are very accessible. Gosh, I'm looking at a typo as I'm talking. Each page must contain a link to the wave tool. Okay, anyway. So I'll stop there for questions. Questions so far? You can mute yourself, unmute yourself if you're muted. Okay. Are you all eating dinner? Is anybody out there?
I'm here, and I take it that
We finished dinner. Dinner's over.
I take it Section 508 is a booming industry for developers, etc.
Well, yeah, it is, especially if you work at a college like Cabrillo, because everybody's scrambling to make sure all the materials conform with the law. And I can tell you it's an awful lot of work.
Every website in the entire universe that I want to use is not accessible. So
That's
I'm
right.
taking the stuff and I'm moving it, and it's like quadrupled, no more, my work.
It's a lot of work.
For a year.
That sounds daunting. That sounds daunting, but as John's pointed out, a vast majority are just, no pun intended, turning a blind eye to it. And
oh, that's bad.
I was not trying to make a joke. I don't think that's funny. Seriously.
If you look at
I
any
think these
page,
people.
if you look at any page on my website, at the bottom in my footer, you will see not only when the page was last revised, but you will see links to the validators and a copyright notice. But you will also see an accessibility link. And if
Right.
you click on that, the bottom of one of my pages, you get the Wave Accessibility Tool evaluation. And look at that, no errors. See that,
Nice.
folks? Woohoo!
Nice.
That's what you want.
Thank you.
Now, there could be alerts, there could be a contrast issues. Pardon? Yeah, Leslie.
Oh, I just want to say the thing that makes me the maddest is I have this browser plugin so that I can check the things that I want to link to.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who have how many errors? 1 error, 2 errors. Why? Why just not quite, or 5?
Well, that's kind of, that lends into what I was saying, and that's awesome on your site.
Yeah.
On your site, John. But that was kind of my point about this being a boom industry. What you initially had said on the topic, and I said people are, not paying attention to, is that basically this is law, but if it's not being enforced and there isn't fines being put into place, then it's kind of a trickle boom industry, as opposed to the second that becomes mandated and there's repercussions, that will blow that market wide open.
Yes. Well, actually, what's blowing it open is lawsuits.
Well, there it is. Money.
It's lawsuits.
That's what I'm talking about.
It's pure and simple. The reason that schools like Cabrillo and others are taking it seriously is because of lawsuits. Many, many organizations have been sued by disability advocates. And it's a real thing. So, at some point, that's how things get forced. So, many, many years ago, when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, and stores had to put in wheelchair ramps and make sure their doors were wide enough to accommodate wheelchairs and that kind of stuff, that was law. And what happened was people started suing, and then these businesses were like, oh, okay, we better put in our wheelchair ramps. We better make this business accessible to people in wheelchairs and so forth. So it's the lawsuits that in this society generally, it's the way things get enforced.
Sadly, yeah.
and this is no different. Lawsuits are really the primary mechanism that the enforcement starts with. I mean, that's the way I see it. Yeah.
It's too bad, but either way, it's nice to see it getting done.
Yeah. So there are a lot of resources online. One of my favorites in this area is called WebAIM, which is Web Accessibility in Media. I can't even remember what it stands for. I think they've changed it. But this WAVE tool is published as part of WebAIM. So WebAIM is a really, really good website. Oh, accessibility in mind, right? AIM, WebAIM, that's it. WebAIM is a really good website for you to start to poke around. And they have lots of stuff here on accessibility and trainings and tutorials. Really, really good, because its focus is web accessibility. So this is my go-to site for accessibility. And they have this tool called the WAVE tool. And when I design a page, I usually run it through the tool, which will flag errors. So this accessible link is something that is extremely useful. Now, as Leslie mentioned, you can always go to the tool directly and plug in an address and then evaluate a page on your own, even if the person who designed the page didn't put a link to the tool. Most people don't put a link to the tool because the tool is going to tell them that they have errors. Yeah, Leslie.
I downloaded a browser plugin.
Right. And how's that work? Pretty well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, except for the part where nothing passes. And I want to make sure that everyone understands that I'm not mad at accessibility. I'm mad at the lazy web people, owners.
Right.
Oh, yeah, no, totally.
Like the owners.
I'm in agreement with you there, 100%.
I totally embrace it. I want my students, and as an instructor, I'm privy to when people have an accommodation, and so I understand because of that how often people need it.
Yeah. And It's when things are more usable by people who have disabilities, they're more usable for everybody, right? I mean, you know, think of all those curbs where they had to put the wheelchair ramps in at the corners of every curb of every intersection in America. Skateboarders love that shit, right? Because before that, maybe some of you don't remember, but I'm old enough to remember before we had all those, and you couldn't, you know, bicycles and going up and down curbs was a pain. But hey, they made it easier for wheelchairs. They made it easier for everybody else too, right? So accessibility is not just the law, it's a good idea. And in terms of web accessibility, there's a lot to it, but there are a few really basic things that you should be aware of. Some of the really common things that you can do that are really easy that make a big difference. Number one, images. You want to have alt text for your images. That's just super easy and super key, right? Many websites fail just because somebody put an image on a page and they didn't write a few words of alt text to describe the image. Well, alt text, as you know, alt and source are the two required attributes of the IMG or image tag, and there's a reason for that. And even though your image will display fine if you don't have alt text, it's not going to validate and it's not going to pass an accessibility evaluation tool. So that's one of the very first, most basic things. All your images should have brief descriptions in alt text. You should have much attention paid to your typography, because if you can't read the type or if you have problems reading type, it's a problem. And it's funny, it reminds me of something. I'm working with Beth Regards on these PDF files for DM1. Gary, I'm sure you recognize this. I literally have to use a magnifying, I mean, I'm not kidding. My eyes were bleary. I'm using a magnifying glass. I'm not kidding. I had to use a magnifying glass to proof it, and it took me an hour to read a few pages. And it's just, yeah, I get people like their PDFs, but all right already, does it have to be 5-point type? So anyway, you know, I know if you're younger, maybe you don't have that problem, but I was like teary-eyed trying to read this PDF. Anyway, I digress. So, I think Leslie and I mentioned contrast before. You know, black type on a white background, okay, that's nice high contrast, no problem there. But what if you have like red type on a green background, or, you know, I mean, blue type on a green background? I mean, these are some issues that make things hard for people. There are certain kinds of color blindness that are more common than others, and I don't know them all offhand, but you can look them up. But you definitely want to avoid some of those combinations. Now, the wave tool also will flag contrast errors, and you can see I have 0 contrast errors. But you can get some information on contrast through the tool itself when you're evaluating your page and play with it. So it has a little built-in contrast evaluator too that you can play, these slider bars and so forth. So it's kind of cool. You can change the colors and see what it looks like. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, there are tools to do that as well. But the wave tool will flag things. Now, just because your site passes the wave tool with no errors, that's the first step. It doesn't mean you're actually completely compliant with the law and that your page is accessible to all. It just means that the software was able to flag or not flag certain things for you to look at. There's no piece of software there's no piece of software that I'm familiar with that will do everything in terms of give you a complete comprehensive report of everything you need to fix. Some things, the software, you need to have human eyes to look at it. But the software will flag the basic errors for you to work on. And what I'm getting at in this final project line here is that you will get points if you put a link on the bottom or somewhere on your page, usually in the footer. Every page should have a link to the wave tool, just as mine does, so that you can click on the link and the wave tool will tell you, yes, that page is accessible. No, that page is not. And what we're looking for is, number one, the errors say 0. There can be alerts and, you know, concerns, features, but this errors, you want 0. So if all of the pages of your project get a 0 error rating, you get 10 points. Okay. Now, how do you put a link on your page to the web accessibility tool? Well, there are a few ways to do that. My site uses PHP, so it automatically supplies the URL to the Wave tool, but we're not going there in this class. But Wave itself gives you a little block of code that you can use. So where is my demo? Okay. So if we look at this code here, we see, okay, there's a link to the HTML validator. There's a link to the CSS validator. I've got 2 spaces between each one because they're all on the same line. And then I added, here's a third link to the accessibility checker or the Wave tool. And unfortunately, their link that supposedly supplies the URL automatically does not appear to work for me. It's supposed to, but it doesn't. So for example, when you copy and paste this block of code for the validator, you don't have to put the URL of the page in. It automatically supplies the URL to the validator. So the validator just picks it up from what's called the referrer, which basically means that the URL is supplied to the validator of the page to check. Same thing with the CSS validator. But the code that they give you on Wave to do that, which uses the word refer instead of refer, it doesn't appear to work. And I've tried it with refer, I've tried it with HTTPS. And if you can make it work, please let me know, because then I can give you better code to use. But in the meantime, if you use this block of code and you make that the URL of the page that you're on, it will work, which means that that block of code has to be modified on each page to include the URL of the page itself, just as this one, because this is a page called demo.html, which I uploaded into my DM60 student directory. So your link would look a little different, but that's what this is about here. Okay. Now, if you can actually do a, here, let me do it right now. What if we do a Google search and we be very specific, code to put, I'm going to literally say code to put on web page to link to Wave tool. Let me see what that yields. Okay, here we go. Didn't give me a block of code. Put one. Okay. Okay, so that doesn't give me what I want. I wanted an actual block of code. Somewhere on their site here, they give it to you. I thought I could find it more easily. I guess not. Oh, look, Wave, Firefox, and Chrome extensions, kind of the thing that Leslie might have been talking about. So there are things you can put in your browser, or you can literally paste a web address right in here to evaluate it. But what I want is for you to put a link on your page similar to the validator links so that I, or more importantly, you, can easily test your pages as you're working on them. You upload the page, you click on the link and see if you've introduced a validation error, just like an accessibility error, just like introducing a validation error. So those of you in video land can see that link. That's what we're talking about. And again, there is a link that I have found that supposedly gives a referrer link, so you can just copy and paste the same link on every page, regardless of what the URL is. I haven't found it to work. Unless you can find that, you can use this and then replace this with the URL of the page that you're putting that code on. Does that make sense to you? Hope so. All right. But if you do a little poking around on the Wave site, see if you can find where they give you the block of code to link to their own tool. And I'm looking not just for a link to the Wave site generically, I'm looking for like the validator's work. It actually supplies the URL to the validator, to the accessibility checker, and it just gives you the report by clicking on the link. That's what we're looking for. And that's what you want. So you want something so that, as on the bottom of my pages, you click on this, accessible, and it just gives you the report right there. You really don't want to have to take extra steps. So accessibility is a big topic. This is just scratching the surface. there are many considerations. Structurally, let's look at this page here. See this demo page that you've seen this before? This is an H1, that's an H2, that's an H2, that's an H3, right? So you've got your primary or most important headline, you have tertiary headline, secondary headlines, and you have a tertiary headline. There's a hierarchy of the way this information is presented on the page. The Wave tool will look at your hierarchy to make sure it makes sense. So for example, if I had a primary headline under a secondary headline, the Wave tool would go, structurally that's kind of confusing, you know, not very easy to understand, not accessible. So your hierarchy of how you structure your information is also a part of the accessibility of your page. So it's not just visually how it looks. I know we're so visual and we're design students and everything is visual in this world, and a lot of us come from the print world, and so we're steeped in visual. But as I've said many times in this course, structural is important in web design. The structure of your page is important. And so accessibility is not only about visually can people see the page and make sense of it. Can software evaluate the page that looks at the structure, the internal structure of your site? Can it make sense of that? Can search engines make sense of what your page is about based on the structure of your content? So accessibility takes many forms, and it's not just visual. Some people are blind and they use software to surf the web that reads the page aloud, and that software will look at your code, and what's in your code is extremely important. So the software will start with, oh, there's an H1, it'll say this is what the page is about, it'll read the H1, the most important headline, and so forth. So when people are coding pages, beginners, sometimes they'll go, oh, I know how to make this text big and bold, I'll make it an H1 or I'll make it an H2. And they don't think about the fact that it's not a headline, but they just want the text to look big and bold, so they make it an H2. Well, that's ridiculous because the text is not necessarily an H2, right? Or they want to put some space between a couple lines of text, and so what do? They make each line of text a paragraph, and that'll make space between them, but maybe that text isn't technically a paragraph. Bad idea. So the structure of how you code and how you present the information is also a big part of accessibility. It's not just visual. Sometimes the page might have a problem because when you click on a link, it opens in a new tab rather than a new window. That in and of itself can be a little confusing to people. So there are all kinds of things structurally to think about when you're designing a page. The important things, again, are the readability of your text, number one. I mean, text is really important, and is it readable? If it's really small, can the user easily make the text big? Okay, so that's another piece of web design that doesn't carry over through something like print. Many times I'll be on a website and I'll go, oh, that text is really small, I'm having trouble reading it. So I'll use my browser, I'll click on the, the little large letter here to make things larger or smaller, And so you may, over time, learn that there are ways to defeat that. You can go to websites where you can't make the text bigger. Have you ever been to some of those sites? Do you find them frustrating? Can you imagine if you were visually impaired how frustrating they would be? So you don't want to disable user controls to make text big or small. Some designers who are, in my mind, weak designers will do that because, again, they come from the print world. They have a print mindset. They have a design, and it's very static, and they don't want the user to screw up their beautiful design. Oh, if the user can bump up the text size, it's going to break my design. I'm going to disable that. And there are ways, and I'm not going to tell you how, because you shouldn't do it, but there are ways to disable these controls of the user being able to make the text bigger or smaller, or having the text flow into a smaller screen and so forth. That's really frustrating, and it's not accessible. You do not want to disable user controls to be able to reflow the text. Yet many sites do that because it breaks their beautiful design, and they're looking at it from a static mindset, And the web is very dynamic. Things flow in different ways depending on a variety of things like the size of the window and how you can resize the type and so forth, what the resolution of the screen is. So you really want to make it easy for users to make it work for them and not harder. And you can do either in your coding. So always make it easier. The contrast, again, that's one thing most people don't think about. Whenever you think about color, it's always in pairs, foreground and background. It's never text color alone. It's never background color alone. It's like, what's being contrasted here? So you want to make sure that you have as high contrast as possible for users who may not be able to easily read the text. Again, there are ways that you can actually give users controls to change colors. In the old Web Publishing 3 class, I had a script that I had people install that would give users controls to change things like the type size and fonts and so forth to make it more readable for them. But there are all kinds of things that you can do. But the most important thing is not to make it worse. If you're not going to make it better, don't make it worse. Don't disable controls. Don't use text that's too small. Don't think of the fact that the way you're seeing the page is the way other people are going to see the page. It's not print. It's not print. It's not print. Okay. Let me shut up for a second and take some questions before I continue. Questions? Observations, comments, concerns? You're not buying it.
It might be break time.
Oh, it is break time. I said I wasn't going to go 3 hours, but I think I'm going to have to go a little longer because I got more stuff I want to cover. How are you guys feeling? Up for a little more, maybe another 20 minutes, half hour?
Sure.
Yeah, I had a question, John.
Who is that? I can't see.
Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca.
Sorry if I'm not
We'll
on
take
the
your question
screen.
and then we'll take a break. Okay, what's your question?
Okay. So my question is, what I've noticed for myself is that it's easier for me to read dark text on a lighter background like you have here on the screen share.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if there was any information about, like, if you're outside using a phone at certain times of day, are there general standards for things like that? Because the amount of light that's around you when you're trying to read something.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Well, first off, the higher contrast, the better, because when you're in bright sunlight, everything is going to be harder to read, and you can't really fix that problem for people. They need to go to the shade or put the hand by the phone or whatever.
Right.
And a lot of the phones have stuff built in now too to kind of accommodate for that. But
But
yeah, that is a problem, and you can't really solve all the problems.
Right. I just know from my own experience that it's hard for me to read light text on a dark background, especially if it's a serif font.
Right.
There's just something about it glowing in my eyes.
And here's something, since I've got this page open on my other screen, let me pull it up here. If we, oops, what happened? Can you see this?
Yeah.
This is this is what I was looking for before about the link to the page, which we'll look at in a second. But look at the bottom here. You see this type?
Yeah.
What do you notice about this? First off, it's a reversal. It's light type on a dark background. It looks like white on black, which is, again, good contrast. But when you do white on black, you know what a good idea is? Make the text bold. Because if you have very thin text and it's white on black, it's harder to read, even though that's high contrast because you're talking about black and white. So you'll notice that this site is really good about that. That's bold, all right? And I think that might be bold. I can't even tell, but if it's not bold, it's a font that's good enough to look readable without being bold. A lot depends on your font choice. Somebody said they're using Open Sans. I can't remember who it was. Was it Josh or Gabe? Okay. Open Sans is a font. It's a free font that's designed for accessibility. That's why it's called Open Sans. So you can find it and download it. It's a really good font for accessibility. In fact, at some point, the next site I create is going to be all Open Sans because it's a good site, a good font for that. Fonts that have really small X height and really thin letters, the stylistic, they might look really nice in print. But on the web, you have to be a little more careful than print because we just don't have the resolution capability of print. At least screen technology is not there yet. Hey, 5, 10 years, what I'm saying might be different. But right now, there are still some resolution differences between screen and print. Yeah, Gary.
Just pointing out, it looks like Adam had posted a question for you in chat.
Oh, I can't see the chat while I'm sharing my screen.
He just says, okay, about ending, I think, early or in 20 or 30 minutes, but he says, are we going to cover the final project?
That's what I want to get to. So let's take a break and we'll do that. Thank you. Let's take 10 and we'll come back. Okie doke.